Most people do not lose control of their lives through sudden catastrophe. They lose it gradually, through the accumulation of small surrenders. One softened boundary here, one swallowed truth there, one moment of silence where honesty should have spoken. Sit with that for a moment. Because the process is so quiet, most people never identify what is happening until years have passed and the distance between who they are and who they intended to become feels impossible to measure. Stoicism does not begin with dramatic transformation. It begins with a single recognition. The recognition that something external has been allowed to occupy the position that only internal discipline should ever hold. That is where the work starts. Not in the world around you, but in the mechanism of your own response. There is a pattern most people carry without naming it. Before they speak, they calculate. Before they act, they measure. Not against principle, not against clarity, but against anticipated reaction. Will this make someone uncomfortable? Will this invite disapproval? Will this cost me something socially? The mind performs this calculation so quickly and so often that eventually the calculation disappears into instinct. The person no longer feels like they are managing perception. They feel like they are simply being considerate, simply being reasonable, simply being mature. That is where the danger becomes invisible. When self-suppression begins to resemble emotional intelligence, the individual stops questioning it entirely. The Stoics understood that the mind is not neutral territory. Whatever a person feeds it consistently, it accepts as normal. If a person repeatedly prioritizes external harmony over internal honesty, the nervous system begins to treat that as the correct order of operations. Discomfort becomes a signal to retreat. Tension becomes something to eliminate rather than something to tolerate. And gradually, without a single dramatic decision, the individual trains themselves into a kind of permanent emotional vigilance. They are always watching, always adjusting, always performing the version of themselves most likely to generate acceptance. Epictetus spoke directly to this. He understood that a person cannot simultaneously pursue approval and pursue freedom. The two directions are fundamentally incompatible. Most people never confront this incompatibility because society does not reward those who confront it. Society rewards agreeableness. Society rewards the person who keeps conversations smooth, who absorbs friction quietly, who never forces anyone to sit inside genuine discomfort. That person is called easy to be around. They are called emotionally mature. They are called a good communicator. And in some environments, those labels feel like achievement. But beneath the praise is a structure that quietly demands continued performance. The moment such a person stops managing the emotional atmosphere, the praise withdraws. That withdrawal teaches a lesson the mind absorbs deeply. Stay comfortable for others, or lose the acceptance you depend on. That lesson does not disappear easily. It operates beneath conscious awareness in most people. It shapes the words chosen in difficult conversations. It determines which truths get expressed and which truths get edited before they reach the surface. It creates a filtering system between thought and speech that runs constantly, silently, and at significant cost to authentic functioning. The Stoics called this kind of dependence slavery, not the visible kind, the internal kind, where a person moves freely through the world but cannot make a single genuine decision without first consulting the emotional reactions of those around them. That is not freedom. That is coordination disguised as character. You can observe this in the way people handle mild disagreement. Someone challenges a position, and immediately the person who held that position begins reconsidering, not because new evidence appeared, not because logic shifted, but because resistance arrived, and resistance feels like danger. So clarity retreats, tone softens. The original point dissolves into qualification after qualification until whatever meaning it carried has been sufficiently reduced to avoid creating friction. The individual calls this being open-minded. Often it is something different entirely. It is conflict avoidance performing as intellectual flexibility, and the person who practices it long enough eventually loses the ability to distinguish between the two. There is another layer beneath this that most people resist examining. The need for control does not always appear as aggression. It does not always look like dominance or manipulation. Sometimes it appears as excessive helpfulness. Sometimes it appears as self-sacrifice carried far beyond what the situation actually requires. Someone overextends themselves not because generosity demands it, but because refusal creates anxiety they cannot tolerate. They give more than they have because the alternative, watching someone withdraw warmth or approval, feels worse than the cost of giving. That pattern is not virtue. It is emotional dependency operating behind a generous face. Recognizing the difference requires the kind of honest self-examination that Stoicism demands, and most people actively avoid. The Stoics were not advocating for coldness. They were not prescribing detachment from human connection or indifference to the experience of others. That misreading of Stoic philosophy is common, but it misses the actual instruction entirely. What they prescribed was internal sovereignty, the ability to care deeply about what is right without requiring approval from others before acting on it. The ability to remain present in a difficult conversation without needing the conversation to conclude comfortably. The ability to hold a position under pressure not out of stubbornness but out of clarity about what genuine reflection already confirmed. That kind of groundedness cannot be borrowed from external validation. It has to be developed internally, through repeated exposure to exactly the kind of discomfort most people spend their lives avoiding. Discomfort is not the enemy. That understanding sits at the center of Stoic discipline. Not comfort, not ease, not the smooth passage through every social situation without friction. The Stoics pointed consistently toward discomfort as the training ground for real strength. A person who never tolerates tension never develops the capacity to remain composed when tension matters. A person who rushes to resolve every uncomfortable silence never learns to sit inside uncertainty without performing. And a person who cannot tolerate disapproval for even a brief period will spend their entire life adjusting behavior to whoever holds the power to withhold acceptance. That is total external control, not partial, total. Most people have experienced a version of this without labeling it. A moment where they knew what they believed, knew what they wanted to say, and said something different because the room did not feel safe enough for honesty. Or a moment where they watched themselves agree with a position that contradicted their actual thinking because disagreement would have required enduring several uncomfortable minutes they were not prepared to tolerate. These moments feel small individually. Collectively, they construct a pattern of behavior that eventually becomes the person's default operating mode. Not occasional compromise. Constant automatic self-suppression. And the longer it continues, the more natural it feels, which makes it significantly harder to interrupt. Interrupting that pattern requires something specific. Not motivation, not inspiration, not a compelling argument delivered by the right voice. What it requires is a moment of recognition so honest that the person cannot return to comfortable denial after experiencing it. The recognition that what they have been calling emotional intelligence is in significant part a mechanism for managing other people's moods at the expense of their own clarity. The recognition that what they have been calling kindness sometimes functions as fear wearing a generous costume. The recognition that their sense of inner peace, when it exists, often depends entirely on how the people around them happen to be feeling on a given day. That is not peace, that is contingency. The Stoics drew a clear boundary between what is within a person's control and what is not. This is perhaps their most foundational principle, and it is also the one most frequently acknowledged without being practiced. Most people intellectually understand that they cannot control how others feel about them. They cannot control how their honesty will be received. They cannot control whether their silence will be interpreted correctly or their directness will be welcomed. They understand this in theory. But in the moment when another person's face shifts, when the atmosphere cools slightly, when subtle disapproval enters the air, understanding collapses entirely. The nervous system overrides the philosophy, and the instinct to restore approval takes over before the mind can intervene. That gap between understanding and practice is precisely where Stoic training lives. It is not enough to read the principle. The principle has to be tested. It has to be pressed against actual conditions of social pressure, actual moments of rejection risk, actual situations where holding steady costs something visible. Epictetus did not write for people who only needed reminding in comfortable moments. He wrote for people who needed instruction they could access when the pressure was real. That is what makes his teaching demanding, and that is what makes most people stop before they genuinely apply it. Because application requires tolerating the discomfort of being misunderstood, being judged, being seen as difficult or cold or arrogant, even when none of those things are true. There is a version of composure that most people recognize and respond to, even when they cannot explain the source of their response. It is not loudness, it is not dominance. It is not the confident performance of someone who has rehearsed their presentation carefully. It is something quieter. A person who does not rush to explain themselves when explanation is not owed. A person who can hold a pause without anxiety visibly rising to the surface. A person whose tone does not shift when the room shifts. Whose certainty does not dissolve when someone pushes back with force rather than logic. That version of composure changes the emotional structure of every interaction it enters. People feel it before they understand it, and it cannot be manufactured. It can only be built through the repeated practice of remaining steady when the instinct is to move. Self-possession is the phrase the Stoics might use here. Not self-promotion, not self-assertion. Self-possession. The experience of being genuinely located inside yourself, rather than perpetually displaced by the reactions happening around you. Most people spend enormous energy occupying mental space that belongs to other people's judgments. They replay conversations not to understand them better, but to search for signs of disapproval they might have missed. They reconsider decisions not because new information emerged, but because someone's expression suggested they might have chosen differently. That is not reflection. That is surveillance of the self through borrowed eyes. And it consumes cognitive energy that belongs to something far more important. When that surveillance begins to quiet, something changes in the quality of a person's attention. Not because external circumstances improve, but because internal conditions shift. The mind that is no longer spending half its resources managing perception has those resources available for genuine observation. Conversations become more interesting because the person is actually present in them, rather than half-present and half-performing. Decisions become cleaner because they emerge from actual reflection rather than from anticipation of how the decision will be received. Words carry more weight because they are selected for accuracy rather than for palatability. Presence becomes more noticeable, not because anything about the person's appearance changed, but because genuine attention is unusual enough to register. The Stoics understood this outcome not as a reward, but as a natural consequence of correct internal ordering. When a person aligns their behavior with their actual values rather than with the shifting expectations of their social environment, the internal fragmentation that comes from constant adjustment begins to heal. Not instantly, not dramatically, slowly through the accumulation of small moments where the individual chose accuracy over performance, where they let silence exist rather than filling it with unnecessary reassurance, where they expressed a view without immediately softening it to protect the comfort of someone who might disagree. Each of those moments is a small act of self-reclamation, and their cumulative effect is a kind of stability that external validation can never provide. It is worth being specific about what this stability does not look like. It does not look like indifference to others. It does not look like the deliberate cultivation of a cold or distant manner. It does not mean refusing to care about impact or treating consideration for others as weakness. Real Stoic composure is not theatrical distance. It is not the performance of someone who has decided emotions are beneath them. It is the genuine experience of being sufficiently rooted internally that other people's approval and disapproval, while noticed, cannot determine the direction of behavior. That distinction matters because the counterfeit version, the person performing detachment as a dominant strategy, is not practicing Stoicism. They are simply addicted to a different kind of approval. Approval from those who see them as unaffected. That is still external dependence. It simply faces a different direction. The genuine version requires something harder. It requires that a person become genuinely comfortable with the possibility that they will not always be understood, that their silence will sometimes be misread, that their refusal to over-explain will occasionally be interpreted as arrogance, that their steadiness will sometimes make others uncomfortable in ways that cannot be resolved quickly. A person who is not yet free from approval dependence finds this possibility genuinely threatening. A person who has done the internal work that Stoic practice demands finds it, if not entirely comfortable, at least acceptable. They have separated their sense of internal stability from the requirement that others interpret them correctly, and that separation changes everything about how they move through the world. Most people underestimate how deeply the need for control is tied to the need for approval. They think of control as something seized by force, something taken. But the most effective form of external control over a person is not force. It is the management of their emotional need for acceptance. A person who requires approval to feel internally stable will modify their behavior, their speech, their expressed beliefs, and eventually their actual beliefs in response to whoever controls the delivery of that approval. They will not experience this as submission. They will experience it as social sensitivity, as emotional awareness, as the natural give and take of human relationships. But the pattern, examined honestly, reveals something different. It reveals a person whose autonomy has been eased out to their social environment without any formal agreement being signed. Reclaiming that autonomy does not happen through rejection of others. It does not happen through the decision to stop caring what anyone thinks in any context. It happens through a more specific and more demanding shift. The shift from needing approval to being willing to function without it when functioning without it is what honesty requires. That willingness is built in increments, in the small moment where someone lets a pause exist rather than rushing to rescue a conversation from silence, in the moment where they offer a perspective without immediately packaging it in reassurance, in the moment where they hold their position when it is challenged, not because they are certain they are right, but because they are certain the challenge is not sufficient reason to abandon clarity. These moments feel uncomfortable when they are new. They feel less so over time. And eventually, they feel like the only way of operating that makes genuine sense. Epictetus described the free person not as someone without constraints, but as someone whose constraints are self-imposed through reason, rather than externally imposed through the expectations of others. That definition matters. Freedom in the Stoic sense is not the absence of discipline. It is discipline directed inward rather than outward. The disciplined management of reaction, of speech, of the timing and quality of one's own attention, not performance for an audience, not the demonstration of equanimity to impress those who are watching. The actual internal experience of choosing response over reaction in the moment when reaction would have been far easier. That is the work. It is not comfortable, and it does not end. Every interaction contains a moment where the old pattern would have surfaced, where the instinct to manage perception would have made one small adjustment to keep everyone at ease. Recognizing that moment, choosing differently in that moment, and tolerating whatever small discomfort follows from that choice is the practice itself, not the concept, not the philosophy held at a comfortable distance, the actual lived experience of remaining steady when steadiness costs something, even briefly. That is what the Stoics pointed toward. Not as an ideal too elevated for ordinary conditions, but as a discipline available to any person willing to begin the work of taking back what they quietly surrendered.